She was delivered to his fence like freight. Wrists, rope-burned raw lips split from days without water. Eyes that had long since stopped believing anyone would come. The note pinned above her heart said only two words: paid, delivered. Nate Calloway hadn't ordered anything but feet and fence wire. But someone had forged his name, stolen his money, and used his reputation to purchase a human being. When she finally opened her eyes and whispered, "You paid for me. Now do it," he understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a crime, and he was standing at the center of it. If you want to know how one man's choice to protect a stranger became the most dangerous decision of his life, stay with me until the very end. Hit like and drop the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat came early to the Arizona territory that summer of 1883, the kind that arrived before first light and never truly left, pressing down on a man's shoulders like something alive, turning the Bradshaw Mountains into wavering ghosts by the time the sun cleared the ridge. By 7 in the morning, the hard pan was already baked white, the earth cracked into jagged plates the color of old bone, and the sparse grass along the fence lines had gone brittle and pale as ash. Nate Calloway stood on the porch of the ranch house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the light move across the eastern pasture. He'd been awake since well before dawn, as he always was, as he had been every morning for the 3 years since Ellie died. Sleep had become a stranger to him in those years, visiting only in brief, restless intervals that left him more exhausted than rested. He had stopped fighting it. The hours before dawn belonged to grief, and grief, he had learned, was not a thing you argued with. The ranch stretched in every direction, 800 acres of scrubland and scattered braes that he worked alone. He'd let the hands go the spring after the funeral, unable to bear their careful silences, the way their eyes slid sideways whenever her name drifted into a sentence. Now it was just him, the cattle, the 2 horses, and the enormous Arizona sky. He drained the last of his cold coffee and was turning to go back inside when something snagged his attention out by the eastern fence line, maybe a quarter-mile out, where the post road ran parallel to his property before curving south toward Prescott. A shape that didn't belong. Dark against the pale morning landscape, still in a way that felt wrong. Nate set his cup on the rail and walked to the corral where his bay gelding, a horse he called Flint, stood already haltered from his morning rounds. He swung up, and they crossed the hard-packed earth toward the fence. Flint moving with the careful steadiness of an animal that had learned to read its rider's moods. The shape resolved itself as they drew close. A wagon, a supply wagon, canvas-topped and sitting motionless at the edge of his fence line. The horse in the traces was a sorry specimen, ribs showing through a dull coat head hanging so low that flies gathered undisturbed at the corners of its eyes. No driver, no movement at all except the listless flutter of torn canvas in the faint morning breeze. Nate reined in Flint a few yards out and sat still listening. Nothing but the creak of the wagon's frame and the dry buzz of insects. He dismounted slowly, his right hand resting instinctively on the grip of the revolver at his hip. "Hello," he called. His voice sounded strange in the morning silence. Too loud, too alone. "Anyone there?" Nothing answered. He approached from the side, keeping his movements deliberate. The smell reached him before he pulled back the canvas sweat and something darker underneath it. The particular smell of human suffering that he recognized from a long time ago and had spent years trying to forget. He pulled back the canvas. For a moment, his mind simply refused to process what lay before him. A woman. Curled on her side on the bare wagon bed, her body folded inward with the helpless compactness of someone who had gone beyond ordinary exhaustion and into some deeper country. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, the skin beneath raw and split where she had pulled against it. Her dress, once perhaps a clear blue-gray, the color of good wool, was so fouled with dust, and worse, that its original color was barely guessable. Her dark hair had come loose and lay tangled across her face. Even in unconsciousness, her features were drawn tight with pain. "Lord," Nate breathed the word, escaping before thought could catch it. He climbed into the wagon bed and crouched beside her. Up close, he could see the bruises, dark crescents on her upper arms, where hands had gripped and held a yellowing shadow along her jaw that spoke of something older and harder than the rope. She couldn't have been more than 25, though suffering had a way of borrowing years from a face. A scrap of paper was pinned to the front of her dress, just above her heart. Nate pulled it free. His hands had gone unsteady without his permission. He smoothed the paper against his palm and read what was written there in blocky, crude letters. Paid, delivered. The world tilted slightly beneath him. He read it again, then again. Repetition didn't change the meaning. Paid, delivered. Like she was a crate of dry goods. Like she was livestock. He crumpled the note in his fist and pulled the knife from his belt, working carefully at the knots binding her wrists. They were tight, professional, tied by someone who knew how to bind a person and expected to do it again. He sawed through them without cutting her, and when the rope fell away, she stirred. A sound came from her. Not a word, not a cry more, the involuntary sound of a body surfacing from very deep water. Her eyes opened. They were gray, the pale, clear gray of a winter sky before snow, and they found his face with the slow, exhausted focus of someone surfacing from a very dark place. What he saw in them hit him somewhere in the chest he hadn't expected to be hit. Not fear, not hope. Something emptier than either. Recognition. The flat recognition of a creature that has been trapped long enough that it has stopped trying to read the hands that approach and simply waits. "You paid for me," she said. Her voice was barely a sound, stripped to its raw edges. "Now do it." Nate rocked back on his heels. "What? Do it." Her eyes stayed on his face with a steadiness that was terrible in its emptiness. "Whatever you paid for. I won't fight anymore." The flatness of those words was worse than any screaming would have been. He had heard screaming before on battlefields, in hospital tents, in the dark hall outside the room where Ellie faded in her last weeks. Screaming still contained resistance. What he heard in this woman's voice contained none. She had gone somewhere beyond resistance, beyond the ordinary grammar of fear, into a place where nothing was left except the waiting. "No," Nate said. Then carefully, "No, I didn't pay for anything." Something shifted in her gray eyes. Not belief, she was far past believing anything easily. But confusion, a door that had been sealed shut opening just a crack. "The note," she said. "There's no name on that note. Just 2 words. He held it up briefly, then set it aside. "Who told you my name?" Her lips moved. He had to lean close to hear. "The man who brought me. He said the rancher who paid. He said the name." A shallow breath that cost her. "Nate Calloway. He said Nate Calloway paid for me." Cold fury began to build behind Nate's sternum, slow and steady as fire catching in green wood. Someone had used his name, had forged his identity, spent money that was associated with him, arranged for a human being to be delivered to his property like a parcel of freight. Someone who knew where he lived, who knew his habits, who had done this deliberately. "What man?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "What did he look like?" But she had drifted again, her breathing going shallow. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat, pulse weak, unsteady. But there. She was alive. For now, that was going to have to be enough. Getting her onto Flint was awkward business, and the gelding stood with unusual patience through the whole of it, as though he understood something was wrong and had decided to be useful. Nate settled her across the saddle and mounted behind her, one arm around her waist, and talked as they rode, not because she could hear him, but because the silence felt wrong. "You're going to be all right. I'm taking you somewhere safe. Nobody's going to put their hands on you again." The house was cool and dark after the blazing morning. He carried her down the hall to the spare bedroom and laid her on the bed as gently as he could manage, then stood back, suddenly uncertain, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had spent 3 years filling his hours with deliberate mechanical certainty. She needed water, food, her wounds cleaned and dressed. She needed a doctor, though the nearest was 2 hours south in Prescott. He started with water. When he returned, she was watching him. Those gray eyes tracked his movement with the measuring vigilance of a cornered animal calculating distances. "I'm going to give you some water," he said, keeping several feet between them. "Can you sit up or do you need help?" She tried, her arms buckled. She fell back against the pillow and something passed across her face that might have been shame. "Here." He sat beside her, carefully giving her time to pull back if she needed to, and slid an arm beneath her shoulders. She went rigid at the contact but didn't pull away. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank in desperate pulls water, running down her chin and soaking into the ruined collar of her dress, and she didn't stop, and she didn't apologize until the cup was empty, and she lay back gasping. "Why?" she asked when her breath returned. Her voice was fractionally stronger. If you didn't pay for me, why bring me inside? Why not just turn me out? Because what was done to you is wrong, he said. And because whoever did it used my name to do it. That makes it my business, whether I want it to be or not. She looked at him for a long moment, testing the statement against whatever internal measure she had left, finding it not convincing but not immediately false. I don't understand, she said. Neither do I yet, but I'm going to find out. He moved to leave. Her voice stopped him low and effortful, like someone calling across a distance that kept changing. My name is Mara Hale. I'm not nothing. I have a name. Nate turned back. I know you're not nothing. I could see that the moment I found you. He held her gaze just long enough for her to feel that he meant it, then went to heat water and gather what he needed from the medical cabinet that Ellie had kept stocked with the same methodical care that had defined everything she did. He cleaned Mara's wrists with carbolic and wrapped them in clean linen, while she lay still, jaw set, eyes fixed at a point above his left shoulder. The morning sun climbed the wall of the spare bedroom in a slow stripe of gold. How long? He asked when the worst of it was done. I don't know. I stopped counting. Weeks, maybe. Where did they take you from? A town called Helena in Montana. A pause. I was a school teacher there. I answered an advertisement for a position in California. Good salary, respectable family room and board. The terms were generous. Something flickered across her face. Too generous. But I needed the work, and I wanted to believe it. Was there a name, a man in charge? She swallowed. They didn't speak to me directly. Not at first. But later, the man who said he was in charge, he told me I'd been sold, that I'd been purchased by a rancher in Arizona. Her voice was even, as though she had already spent all the emotion available for this particular fact. They called him something. Rook. His name was Rook. Nate went still. He knew that name. He knew it the way you know a thing you'd rather not know. Not from personal acquaintance, but from careful avoidance, from the particular silence that fell over a room when certain names were spoken too close to the wrong ears. Gideon Rook, he said. Not a question. Mara looked at him sharply. You've heard of him? I've heard things. He rose from the chair and moved to the window. Outside, Flint stood at the water trough tail flicking at flies. The ranch was utterly quiet. He operates out of Prescott, has for years. People know what he does, or suspect it, but no one stops him. No one has yet. Nate turned back to face her. That doesn't mean no one can. She studied him with those pale, exhausted eyes. You're one man, you live alone. You rarely come to town. She said it without cruelty, simply cataloging what was true. What can one man do against someone like Rook? I don't know yet, Nate said honestly, but I'm going to find out. He left her with water and food within reach. The door unlocked, but with its iron bolt accessible from the inside, and rode south toward Prescott, before noon, pushing Flint harder than he should have, his mind working through the problem, the way you work through a tangle of fence wire, patiently looking for the place where the whole thing comes loose. Prescott was the county seat and the largest settlement in that stretch of territory, a proper town, with a main street and a courthouse and all the commerce that 2,000 souls required. Nate had come here often in the early years, monthly for supplies and news. He'd come less often since Ellie died. The town felt too loud now, too full of the kind of ordinary human life that had once seemed unremarkable and now felt almost cruel in its normalcy. He tied Flint outside the general store and pushed through the door into the cool dimness. Ben Whitfield stood behind the counter, a heavy-set man, with kind eyes and the perpetual expression of someone who was always faintly worried he'd miscounted something. He looked up as Nate entered, and his face cycled through welcome, then something more complicated. Nate Calloway, must be 3 months at least, getting to be a hermit up there. Ben, Nate came to the counter and kept his voice even. I need to look at my account ledger, my last order. Ben's expression shifted. He reached under the counter and produced the ledger, setting it flat between them. Nate looked down at his name at the top in Ben's careful hand, the usual items, feed, fencing, wire. And below that, in different writing, blocky, crude, unmistakably the same hand that had written paid, delivered a second entry, special delivery, prepaid in full, to be left at Calloway Fence at sunrise. He stared at it. I didn't write that, Ben said quietly. He had gone the color of old candle wax. Nate, I swear to you, who had access to this ledger, anyone who came in, my clerk, the delivery boys. Ben's voice dropped. There was a new driver, came to me about 2 months back, said he was available for deliveries, said Gideon Rook had vouched for him. The name landed between them like a stone into still water. Rook sent you a driver, Nate said flatly. He has his hand in half the businesses in town. I thought it was... I didn't think... Ben looked down at the ledger, then up at Nate, his face stricken. What was the delivery, Nate? What did they leave at your fence? Nate didn't answer. He was looking at the price column. $300 charged against his account. Money he had deposited with Ben months ago for future orders. The money's already been withdrawn, Ben said barely above a whisper. 2 weeks ago, someone came in with what looked like your signature. It wasn't my signature. I know that now. Ben's hands pressed flat against the countertop. I'm sorry, I don't know what I should have done differently, but I'm sorry. Where's the driver now? Gone, left town 4 days ago without a word. Ben hesitated. Gideon Rook has an office above the Red Rose Saloon, second floor end of the hall. But Nate, his voice tightened with real fear. Don't go up there alone. The man is not someone you can reason with. He has protection. Territorial government, the sheriff men on the bench. Thank you, Ben. Nate. But Nate was already through the door. The Red Rose occupied the corner of Main and Copper, a 2-story building that had been painted the color its name suggested at some point and had since faded to the dusty red of dried blood. A piano was playing inside, something cheerful that sounded obscene given the circumstances. 2 men stood at the entrance, one broad and heavy, one lean and watchful, with the particular stillness of men who were paid to observe. Nate crossed the street without slowing. Help you, the broad one asked. Here to see Rook. Tell him Nate Calloway's here. Tell him it's about a delivery. The 2 men exchanged a look. Recognition calculation. Then the broad one disappeared inside and the lean one watched Nate with the unblinking focus of a rattlesnake, still deciding. Several minutes. Then, he'll see you, second floor, end of the hall. The interior of the Red Rose was what Nate expected: long bars, scattered tables, a few afternoon drinkers who looked up as he passed and looked away just as quickly. He climbed the back stairs slowly, his hand near his gun. The office at the end of the hall was larger than it had any right to be, paneled in dark wood and lit by 2 oil lamps even at midday. Heavy curtains drawn against the windows. A massive desk at the center of the room like a throne. Behind it sat Gideon Rook. He was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair swept back from a broad forehead, the weathered face of a man who had once worked outdoors, and the soft, unworked hands of a man who now made others do it for him. His eyes were pale blue, the color of water over limestone, beautiful and utterly cold, and they fixed on Nate with the expression of perfect, practiced calm. Mr. Calloway, he didn't rise. I understand you have some concern about a recent transaction. A woman was left at my fence this morning. Nate remained standing, keeping the desk between them, bound, half-starved, with a note saying she'd been bought in my name. Rook tilted his head slightly. How terrible. Someone forged my signature at the general store, spent money from my account, used my name to falsify a purchase, and have a human being delivered to my property like freight. Nate kept his voice level with effort. The driver who made the delivery was sent to Ben Whitfield by you. I recommend drivers to many local businesses. I'm a businessman, Mr. Calloway. It's natural that I maintain... The woman says the man in charge of her captors was called Rook. The calm behind those pale eyes didn't crack, but something recalculated itself behind it. Nate could see it happening, the small invisible adjustment. Traumatized women say many things, Rook said with measured sympathy. Their memories are often unreliable, especially after. Her memory seemed clear enough to me. And yet here you are with no proof, no witnesses, nothing that would hold up in any court in this territory. Rook rose from his chair and came around the desk, a broad, solid man who had once been formidable and still carried the echo of it. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Calloway. I am a man of considerable standing in this community. I have friends in the territorial legislature. I have friends among the judiciary. I have friends who would be deeply disturbed to hear that a grieving widower, a man who rarely leaves his ranch, had begun making unfounded accusations against a pillar of this town's commerce. Is that a threat? It's a clarification. Rook stopped a few feet away, close enough that Nate could smell the pomade in his hair. The woman you found, whatever she told you, whatever she believes is property that was legally purchased, legally transported, legally delivered. If you're troubled by the methods, take it up with the delivery man, who I'm told has left town. A shame. She's not property. The bill of sale says otherwise. Rook returned to his desk with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had to run from anything. And since your name appears on that bill of sale, Mr. Calloway, I suppose that makes her your problem. Good day. Nate stood in the middle of that carefully appointed room for 3 long seconds, the fury behind his sternum cold and controlled and looking for somewhere to land. Then he turned and walked out, because staying would only get him killed, and getting killed would leave Mara Hale entirely alone. He rode back to the ranch in the last red light of afternoon, his mind working through the problem, the way you work through fence wire, patiently looking for the place where the whole thing comes loose. Rook was right about one thing: Nate had nothing that would stand up in court. A woman's word against a wealthy, connected man. A ledger entry in someone else's handwriting. A driver who had vanished. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough on its own. But there had to be something. Men like Rook didn't build what he'd built without leaving evidence somewhere. Without someone who knew. He found Mara in the kitchen when he returned, sitting at the table with a cup of tea going cold before her bandaged wrists resting in her lap, watching the door as if she'd been listening for his horse for the last hour. Rook admits nothing, Nate said, pulling out the chair across from her. Claims the transaction was legal. Claims your property. Her face didn't change. She had expected exactly this. He could see it in the stillness of her expression, not shock, not devastation, just the quiet confirmation of something she'd already known. So, that's it, she said. There's nothing to be done. I didn't say that. She looked up at him. You said it yourself. He has protection. The law is in his pocket. My word against his. For now, Nate leaned forward, elbows on the table, holding her gaze. But there's a way to take his legal claim off the table entirely. A way he can't challenge in any court in this territory. Mara waited. Marriage, Nate said. If you were legally married, his bill of sale means nothing. A married woman can't be claimed as property. His forged receipts, his fraudulent paperwork, none of it would have any legal standing. You'd be protected. A long silence. You're suggesting I find a husband, she said carefully. I'm suggesting you already have one, if you want. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not asking for anything, Mara. Not expecting anything. This would be an arrangement, protection in name. Nothing more. And when it's over, when Rook is dealt with, and you're truly free, you go wherever you choose. No conditions, no claims. She stared at him across the table for a long moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was fading, painting the kitchen walls in amber and rust. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Nate was quiet for a moment, then, my wife died 3 years ago. I sat beside her for 18 months while she faded, and I couldn't do a single useful thing. Not one. He looked at his hands. After she was gone, I made myself a promise that if I ever had a real chance to help someone, not just stand by and watch, I wouldn't let it pass. He looked up at her. You showed up at my fence. That's not nothing. Mara said nothing for a long while. The kitchen settled into its evening sounds, the tick of the stove cooling the distant complaint of the windmill in the night breeze. I'll think about it, she said at last. Take whatever time you need. He left her there and went to sit on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark. Somewhere out there, Gideon Rook was making plans. The evening star came out above the western ridge, pale and solitary, and Nate Calloway kept watch over a woman he barely knew, in a situation that was going to get considerably worse before it got better. He was certain of both. She found him in the morning. He was standing at the window of the spare bedroom when he heard her door open down the hall, the measured, deliberate footsteps of someone who had decided something and was moving before the decision could change its mind. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, and she turned to face him before he'd finished crossing the room. Yes, she said without preamble. I'll marry you, Nate Calloway. But I want it understood. Go ahead. This is an arrangement, not a romance. I'm not your wife in anything but name. Her jaw was set, her gray eyes steady. And if I ever decide to leave, you leave. Yov. No conditions, no question asked. She studied him for one more moment, looking for the seam in the offer, the place where the generosity ended and the expectation began. She didn't find it. Then let's go, she said, before Rook has time to do anything about it. And the minister in Prescott was a young man named Reverend Crane, who seemed vaguely alarmed by the whole situation, but performed the ceremony with professional efficiency in his small whitewashed church, his wife the sole witness. 15 minutes and it was done, words spoken, paper signed, and suddenly Nate Calloway had a wife for the second time in his life. A wife who stood beside him in the churchyard afterward, squinting in the noon sun, her bandaged wrist tucked carefully beneath her sleeves, a complete stranger who now bore his name and to whom he had made promises he fully intended to keep. Strange, she said, not quite to him. Very, he agreed. Yesterday I was cargo. Her voice was flat, almost wondering. Today I'm a wife. Today you're free, he said. The rest is just paperwork. She turned and looked at him for a moment. Something flickered in those gray eyes, not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the first faint shadow of something that was not entirely distrust. We'll see, she said, and she walked back toward the horses. 3 days passed in that strange suspended quiet that follows crisis, not peace exactly, but its imitation. Nate gave her room in understanding that trust was not a thing you could ask for or earn quickly. It accreted slowly the way limestone builds, layer by invisible layer, through consistency rather than drama. So he went about his work, mended fence, fed cattle, always let her know before he left the yard and when he'd return. He knocked before entering any room. He kept his voice low and his movements unhurried. He left coffee on the stove every morning and didn't make an occasion of it. On the fourth morning, he found her standing at the kitchen window, watching the light move across the eastern pasture, a cup of coffee cradled between her bandaged hands. She didn't turn when he entered, but she spoke the first words she'd offered without prompting. I used to watch the sunrise from my classroom window back in Helena, she said. The children would arrive just as the light came over the mountains, and I'd think, this is enough. This simple life. This is mine. A pause. I was a fool. You weren't a fool, Nate said, moving to the stove. He kept his back to her, giving her the privacy of talking without being watched. You were hopeful. There's a difference, is there? Her voice was dry. Hope is what got me onto that train. Hope is what kept me from fighting back for the first 2 days, because I kept thinking someone would notice. Someone would come. A short, empty sound. No one came. I came. A silence. Then quietly, eventually. He turned to face her. She was still looking out the window, her profile calm and still, the way a face goes when the person wearing it has learned to keep what they feel from showing. He'd seen that look before on men coming back from places they couldn't talk about. The deliberate blankness of someone who had put their interior life somewhere out of reach so nothing could touch it. Why does everyone want something, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. You keep doing things, the water, the bandages, the marriage bringing me inside. And I keep waiting for the part where you tell me what it costs. It doesn't cost you anything. Everything costs something. She finally turned from the window. The morning light caught the angles of her face, the fine jaw, the dark circles beneath the pale eyes. Men don't do things for nothing. Nate poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at the end of the table, leaving space between it and himself. He sat down. My wife's name was Ellie, he said. She was sick for a long time before she died. A wasting sickness, something in her lungs that no medicine could touch. A year and a half of watching it happen and not being able to stop any of it. He wrapped his hands around his cup. That's a particular kind of helplessness, knowing exactly what's happening and having no power over any of it. Adeline Mara had turned fully from the window, now watching him. After she was gone, he continued, I made myself a promise that I wouldn't waste any chance I had to actually help someone, that I wouldn't stand by and do nothing when doing something was possible. He looked up. You were in that wagon. I could do something. So I did. That's a heavy burden, she said slowly, to lay on a stranger's suffering. Maybe, but it's the honest answer. She picked up the coffee cup. Her hands were still unsteady enough that she needed both of them to hold it without spilling, but she managed. She stood there for a moment, testing the words against whatever internal measure she used, looking for the crack in them. "All right," she said at last. Not warmth, not trust, but the closest thing to it she could manage on 4 days' acquaintance. "All right." The sound came without warning just after noon hoofbeats from the direction of the road. Multiple horses moving with the deliberate pace of men who weren't worried about being noticed. Nate was at the window before the sound had fully registered, his rifle already in his hand. "Get to the back room," he said. "Bar the door." Mara didn't argue. He heard her footsteps down the hall, the bolt slide home, and then he was on the porch watching 4 riders emerge from the dust. He recognized the one in front, a broad, heavy-shouldered figure with a nose that had been rearranged by someone's fist at some point. He'd been standing outside the Red Rose. Rook's man. "That's close enough," Nate called out, raising his rifle. The riders pulled up 30 yards from the porch. The broad man smiled, the particular smile of someone who uses it as an instrument rather than an expression. "Mr. Calloway, Mr. Rook sends his regards." He sat easy in the saddle reins loose. "He's a reasonable man. He understands there's been some confusion about the merchandise that was delivered here. He's prepared to offer you a full refund, $300, if you'll return what belongs to him." "Nothing here belongs to Rook. The woman does." The smile didn't move. "He's got paperwork to prove it." "She's my wife." Nate kept the rifle level. "Legally married in Prescott this week, recorded with the county clerk. Whatever paperwork Rook has is void." Something shifted behind the broad man's eyes. Recalculation. "Mr. Rook sees that as a breach of contract." The man leaned forward slightly. "He's willing to be generous, Mr. Calloway. Take the money. Call it a misunderstanding. Walk away." "I'm going to count to 10, Nate said. "When I reach 10, I start shooting." 1. The broad man's smile disappeared. "You're 1 man against 4. The math doesn't." 2. "Mr. Calloway, I'd advise you to 3. The riders exchanged glances. Uncertainty flickered. Intimidation had failed to produce the expected result, and men who rely on intimidation are poorly equipped for its absence. 4. "All right." The broad man raised one hand palm out. "We're going, but this isn't finished, Calloway. Mr. Rook doesn't forget, and he doesn't lose." 5, Nate said. They rode. He kept the rifle raised until they were out of range, then lowered it slowly, his hands less steady than he would have liked. Behind him, he heard the back door open, then Mara's footsteps on the porch boards. "They'll come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "With more men." She stood beside him, watching the settling dust. "Walls won't stop him, Nate. The marriage slows him down, but it doesn't stop him. He'll find a way." "I know that." "Then we can't just defend." Her voice had changed. Something had sharpened in it, hardened like iron cooling after the forge. "We need to take the fight to him. His power comes from secrecy. From the fact that what he does happens quietly below the surface where no one has to look at it." She turned to face him. "But I was there. I was inside it. I know what I saw." Your word against his. My word in evidence. Documents. Witnesses. There have to be others, women who escape, people who saw something, someone who kept records. Her gray eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with desperation. It was cleaner than desperation. More dangerous. He can't have covered every track. Nate studied her for a long moment. 4 days ago, she had lain in his wagon and asked him to do whatever he'd paid for because she had nothing left to fight with. The woman standing beside him on the porch now was a different person, or the same person finally surfacing from under the weight of what had been done to her. "It's dangerous," he said. "Everything is dangerous." She didn't look away. "At least this way, we're moving towards something instead of waiting for him to come to us." He thought about Ellie, about the 18 months of helplessness, about the promise he'd made. "All right," he said, "but we do it carefully. We do it together." For the first time since he'd found her, something moved in Mara Hale's face that wasn't pain or calculation or controlled fear. Something that might in better light have been called the beginning of resolve. They started the next morning before dawn. Nate knew Prescott well enough to know where information lived and who might be persuaded to share it. His first stop was Ben Whitfield, who listened to what Nate needed with his hands flat on the counter and his face cycling through expressions of fear and guilt, and something that finally settled into resolve. "There's a woman," Ben said quietly after a long silence. "Runs a boarding house on Oak Street. Her name is Pearl Morgan. Her sister disappeared 3 years ago, one of Rook's victims. I think she's been watching him ever since." He paused, glancing toward the door. "I don't know what she has, but if anyone in this town knows where the bodies are buried, it's her." "How do you know about her?" "Because she came to me a year ago asking if I'd ever noticed anything strange in my ledgers." Ben met his eyes. "I told her no." Another pause. "I was lying." "Don't tell her I sent you," Nate said. "Don't tell anyone you talk to me." Ben's hands pressed flat against the countertop. His face was stricken. "Rook has people everywhere, Nate. People you'd never suspect. Be careful." "I will." He rode to Oak Street without looking back. The boarding house was a 3-story frame building, clean and respectable, with a wide porch and dark shutters. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 35, iron gray braids, sharp dark eyes that assessed him in 3 seconds and didn't share what they concluded. "I'm looking for Pearl Morgan," Nate said. "You found her. What do you want?" "I want to talk about Gideon Rook." The assessment in her eyes shifted, not alarm, not surprise, but a sharpening focus. The focus of someone who had spent years waiting for a particular conversation to arrive. "Come inside," she said. She led him to a back room that smelled of lemon polish and dried herbs. Curtains drawn, a small writing desk covered in papers. She sat across from him and set her hands in her lap and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is its own form of power. "My sister's name was Rose," she said before he had asked anything. 23 years old. She answered one of his advertisements 3 years ago. I've never heard from her since." "I'm sorry." "What do you want, Mr. Calloway?" He told her everything. The wagon at the fence, Mara's captivity, the forged signature, the visit to Rook, the 4 riders at his porch. Pearl listened without interrupting, her hands still in her lap, her face giving nothing away. When he finished, she rose and went to the writing desk. "I've spent 3 years keeping track," she said, pulling open the bottom drawer and removing a leather journal, then a folder stuffed with folded papers, shipping records, ledger copies, testimony from 4 women who passed through and were willing to talk before they moved on. She set the papers on the low table between them. "I've been waiting for someone with standing to take this further. There may be a federal judge in Tucson, a man named Morrison. I've heard he's the kind who can't be purchased." Pearl looked up sharply. "Then we need to get this information to him. But Tucson is 4 days' ride and Rook has eyes on every road between here and there. Then we'll have to be creative about the route." Nate picked up the journal. "Is there more than what's here?" "There's more." Something moved in Pearl's dark eyes, something that might have been, after 3 years, the first real flicker of hope. "But I need to meet the woman first. I need to hear her story." "She's prepared," Nate said. "She's more than prepared." Pearl nodded once. "Decisive." "Bring her tomorrow," she said, "and then we'll talk about how to reach Judge Morrison." He rode back to the ranch with Pearl's journal in his saddlebag and the feeling, fragile, provisional, the kind of feeling you're almost afraid to name, that the situation had shifted. Not in their favor, not yet, but no longer entirely against them. Mara was sitting on the porch steps when he returned. She rose when she saw his face. "You found something," she said. "I found someone." He swung down from Flint. "A woman named Pearl Morgan. She's been tracking Rook for 3 years. Her sister was one of his victims." Something crossed Mara's face, a kind of recognition, the particular fellowship of specific grief. "She wants to meet you," Nate continued. "Tomorrow. She has documentation, shipping records, witness testimony. Combined with what you know, it might be enough to take to a federal judge." Mara was quiet for a moment, looking at him across the yard in the late afternoon light. Her arms were wrapped around herself, not from cold. It was still 90 degrees in the shade, but from something else, something internal. "It'll be dangerous," she said, "taking this to a judge. Rook will find out. He'll find out either way." Nate met her eyes. "The question is whether we find a way to bring him down before he finds a way to stop us." Another silence. Then Mara looked at the eastern fence line, the section where the wagon had stood, where all of this had begun, and something set itself in her expression, resolute and a little grim and not afraid. "Tomorrow then," she said, "tomorrow." That night Nate sat on the porch watching the stars come out. He heard the door open behind him and Mara stepped out and lowered herself to the top step, a blanket around her shoulders. She sat close enough that they were almost side by side but not quite touching, and she looked at the same sky he was looking at for a while without speaking. "Tell me about her," she said at last. "Your wife." Nate looked down at his hands. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you're willing to say." He thought about it for a moment. Then, she laughed at herself. That was the first thing I noticed, the way she could see the absurdity in a situation and just laugh. Not bitterly, genuinely. A pause. It's a rare quality. I don't think I ever told her how much I admired it. Mara was quiet. "She used to say that the best thing about living out here was the sky," he continued. "Back east, the sky had edges, buildings, trees, the curve of hills. Out here, it just goes on." He looked up. "She was right about that." "She sounds like someone worth grieving," Mara said softly. She was. He turned to look at her profile. "What about you? Was there someone before all this?" A long pause. "There was a man, in Helena. We'd been keeping company for about a year." Her voice was careful even. "When his family found out that I was an orphan, raised at the county home, they decided I wasn't suitable. He tried to argue with them for about a week." She picked a loose thread on the edge of the blanket. "And then he stopped trying." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It told me something useful about him." She looked up at the scone. "After that, I threw myself into teaching. It was the only thing that was entirely mine. And then I answered an advertisement." They sat in silence after that shoulder almost touching shoulder on the porch steps while the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and went still. It wasn't comfortable exactly, too much damage on both sides, too much recent fear, but it was something. The beginning of a something that didn't have a name yet. "Nate," she said quietly when she finally rose to go inside. "Yes. Thank you for today, for all of it." A pause. "I'm not sure I believe this is going to work, but I'm glad we're trying." He looked up at her. "We're going to make it work." She held his gaze for a moment, then small and tentative and real. "All right." She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another hour, watching the dark, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come, thinking about the woman sleeping behind the bolted door at the end of the hall, about the 3 years of records in his saddlebag, about Judge Morrison in Tucson, and all the roads between here and there that Gideon Rook was watching. In Prescott, above the red rose, Gideon Rook sat behind his desk and read the marriage record his courier had obtained from the county clerk. He read it twice. Then he set it down and reached for the small brass bell on the corner of his desk. "So the rancher thinks a piece of paper will save her," he said to no one in particular. He rang the bell. His men came. Pearl Morgan met them at the door of the boarding house before they'd finished tying their horses, which told Nate she'd been watching and had been watching for some time. She looked at Mara with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 3 years learning to recognize a certain kind of story in another person's face. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you." She led them to the back room. Tea was already waiting along with a plate of biscuits that no one touched. Pearl sat across from them and set her hands in her lap and looked at Mara. "Tell me," she said simply. Mara told her. She started in Helena with the newspaper advertisement and the careful, plausible letter that had followed her inquiry. She described the men waiting at the train station, the wagon that was already moving before she understood what was happening, the days of travel in heat and darkness. She described the other women, 3 of them at different points along the route, glimpsed in other wagons or heard through canvas walls. She described the man who called himself the manager, who spoke to her once and told her she had been purchased by a rancher in Arizona. Pearl wrote in a small leather notebook throughout, asking precise, unemotional questions about routes and timing and physical descriptions. Mara answered them all with the same controlled steadiness, her eyes on Pearl, or on the space between them, focused inward on the accuracy of what she was saying. When she finished, Pearl set down her pen and was quiet for a moment. "Rook has been running this for at least 6 years, she said, "probably longer. The advertisements are placed in newspapers across the Midwest and South. They target women in specific circumstances, educated women working, women without close family. Women who would be missed slowly, if at all. She opened the folder from the desk. I have shipping manifests where women are listed as dry goods. I have copies of contracts that use coded language to describe human purchases. I have testimony from 4 survivors written and signed. She set the papers on the table. And now I have you. Is it enough? Nate asked. It should be enough for Judge Morrison to issue a warrant. The difficulty is getting it to him before Rook has a chance to intercept. Pearl paused. There's a telegraph office in Mineral Creek, 20 miles east in the foothills. Small place outside Rook's direct reach. The operator there is a woman named Clara Webb who has her own reasons to dislike Rook. She can be trusted to send a message to Tucson. And Rook has eyes on the main roads. He does. Pearl rose and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the quiet street below. Which is why we take the mountain route east. Harder, slower, but they won't expect it. She turned back. I'm coming with you. Pearl, it's dangerous. I've been doing this alone for 3 years, Nate. Her dark eyes were level and utterly calm. I know the risks better than you do, and I have the documentation. Without me, you have Mara's testimony. With me, you have enough to put him away. Nate looked at Mara. She comes, Mara said simply. Pearl nodded. We leave tomorrow at first light. Pack light and bring your rifles. They rode out of Prescott before dawn, the 3 of them moving east on the back road that wound up into the foothills, the sun still below the horizon and the air cool enough to see their breath. No one spoke much. The horses moved steadily, and Nate watched the terrain on both sides with the attention of a man who knows he's being watched. They were an hour out of town when the riders found them. 3 men came out of the scrub on the left side of the road, not fast, not charging, just emerging with the deliberate unhurriedness of men who had been waiting and had the confidence of men who expected no resistance. The broad-shouldered man was in the center. He reined in across the road and blocked the way forward, sitting easy in the saddle. Mr. Calloway? He looked past Nate to Pearl and Mara. Miss Morgan. He said the last name with particular emphasis, making it clear that nothing they'd done in the past 24 hours had been private. Mr. Rook sends his regards. He'd like you to turn around. We're on a public road, Nate said. You have no authority to block it. Mr. Rook has authority enough. The broad man's eyes moved to Mara. She's the problem. The rest of you can ride on. She rides with us, Nate said. That's unfortunate. The broad man's hand moved toward his hip, because he didn't finish the sentence. Nate had drawn not with the blinding speed of legend, but with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had learned long ago that speed is less important than certainty, and the barrel of his revolver was leveled at the broad man's chest before the man's fingers had closed on his own grip. A long, frozen moment. The 3 riders looked at the gun, at Nate's face, at the fact that Pearl's rifle had come up from her saddle scabbard during the same interval. Something that might have been a calculation going badly wrong moved through the broad man's expression. You're making a serious mistake, he said. Turn around, Nate said. Ride back to town. Tell Rook that federal law is coming for him whether he likes it or not. Another moment, then the broad man gathered his reins, gave a short jerk of his head to his companions, and they rode back into the scrub. Nate holstered his weapon and looked at Pearl. They'll report back, she said. We have perhaps 4 hours before Rook decides his next move. We need to reach Mineral Creek. They pushed the horses harder after that. The terrain climbed as they moved east, the scrubland giving way to pine and juniper, the air cooling as they gained elevation. No riders came after them on the road. Nate didn't know whether that meant Rook was regrouping or simply waiting for a better opportunity. He watched the ridge lines and kept moving. Mineral Creek was small, a handful of buildings clustered around a central well, a general store, a church with a crooked steeple. The telegraph office was in the back of the post office, run by a woman with iron-gray braids and eyes the color of dark earth, who looked at Pearl when she introduced herself and said simply, I've been expecting something like this. Nate dictated the message himself, a summary of Rook's operation, the documentation Pearl was prepared to provide, the request for federal intervention, the urgency. Clara woke up but listened, nodded once, and bent to her key. The clicks filled the small room. How long before a reply? Mara asked. Could be an hour. Could be tomorrow morning. Clara glanced up. Depends on whether the judge is in his office. We'll wait, Nate said. They took rooms at the boarding house above the general store, 2 rooms, Pearl and Mara in one, Nate in the other, and Nate spent the night at the window watching the road below while the town slept around him. Shortly before dawn, a knock at the door. Clara Webb. Reply came in, she said, holding out a folded paper. About an hour ago. Thought you'd want to see it. Nate unfolded it. Evidence received. Warrant being prepared. Federal deputies departing Tucson at first light. Expect arrival within 72 hours. Hold your position and do not engage. Morrison. He read it twice. Then he let out a long, slow breath, the release of something that had been compressed inside his chest for days. Mara was in the doorway of the next room watching him. He held up the paper. She crossed the hall and read it. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. 72 hours, she said. We just have to stay ahead of Rook for 3 days. We've managed so far. She folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Her fingers brushed his in the exchange just briefly, just for a moment, and neither of them moved away immediately. We can keep doing it. In Prescott, above the red rose, Gideon Rook received his writer's report in the lamplight and listened to everything without changing expression. When the man finished, Rook was quiet for a long time. So they've sent a telegraph to the federal judge, he said at last, and deputies are coming. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. 3 days. He set the pen down. That should be enough. He rose from his desk and straightened his collar with the methodical precision of a man getting dressed for an important occasion. Gather the men, he said, all of them. The second morning in Mineral Creek came in cold and still clouds building to the west that might mean rain or might mean nothing. Nate had been awake for most of the night and was on his second cup of coffee when Pearl came to find him at the window. Ryder came through before dawn, she said, pulling out a chair. Her face was composed, her voice level. A man named Garrett used to work for Rook, decided some weeks ago that he'd rather not end up in a federal prison. He brought word. What word? Rook is moving, gathering all his men leaving Prescott today. He knows about the telegraph. He knows deputies are coming, and he's calculated that he has 3 days to make us irrelevant. Pearl set her hat on the table. He's coming here. Garrett counted 18 men, maybe more. The number settled on the table between them. We can't fight 18 men, Nate said. No. Pearl turned her hat in her hands. But we might not have to fight them. We just have to last 3 days. How we're in a town of 40 people. Rook can ride in here and take what he wants. He can. Pearl looked at him steadily. Or maybe he has a problem he hasn't fully accounted for. She explained what she had in mind while Nate listened. By the time she'd finished, Mara had appeared in the doorway dressed and alert. We're going to use the town, Mara said. She'd absorbed what she'd heard, quickly pulling the implications together before Pearl had finished. The people who've been living in Rook's shadow. Some of them know what he is, Pearl said. Some of them have their own losses. She looked at Mara. I could go first. People respond differently when a woman asks. She was gone for 3 hours. When she came back, she had a quiet determination about her that was different from the controlled endurance she usually wore. 11 people, she said. 11 who are willing to stand as witnesses if it comes to a confrontation. More who'll watch from windows. She sat down. They've been waiting, most of them. They just needed someone to start. The rest of the day was preparation. Pearl organized it with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent years planning for exactly this kind of moment. Not military precision, but something practical and human accounting for the fact that these were farmers and tradespeople and a retired blacksmith, not soldiers, and would scatter if things went badly wrong. Positions were identified, signals were agreed upon. Evie, who ran the general store and had a face that suggested she had seen most of what the world could offer and had not been impressed, volunteered her shotgun and her second-floor window. Nate spent the afternoon going over Mara's testimony with her again, not because she needed to practice it, but because something about the act of speaking it aloud clearly and without flinching seemed to do something useful for both of them. She sat across the table from him and described what had been done to her with the measured steadiness of someone who has decided that the events belong to the past and the past cannot reach her unless she lets it. You don't have to do this in front of a crowd, he said when she'd finished. Yes, I do. She looked at him directly. Because every minute I stay quiet is a minute that women still in Rook's network are being moved somewhere further away from anyone who can help them. A pause. I didn't survive what I survived so I could stay quiet. He looked at her face, at the quality of stillness in it, not resignation, not even courage exactly, but something more fundamental: clarity. She had looked at what she was going to do, and she had accepted it, and she was not afraid of it. Will you stay close? She asked it without flourish, without apology. Yes, he said simply. Evening came. Pearl posted a watch on the road. Nate sat with Mara on the steps outside the boarding house, the sky going through its enormous color changes overhead. And they talked not about Rook, not about what was coming, but about other things. About Helena and the children she'd taught, and which ones she still thought about. About the ranch and what it had been like before Ellie died and what he'd hoped it might become. Small, specific things. The kind of things you talk about when you're trying to remember that life extends past the edge of the crisis you're standing in. The watch rider came back at midnight. They were a day out. Maybe let. Rook was moving faster than Pearl had projected. He's not going to wait for us to get comfortable, Pearl said, pulling everyone together in the front room of the boarding house. Her voice was even matter-of-fact. He'll arrive tomorrow morning, probably before the town is fully awake. He wants to hit us before we're ready. And the deputies from Tucson, 2 days away at best. The arithmetic was ungenerous. Then we hold, Nate said. 1 day. We hold him off for 1 day. Pearl looked around the room at Nate, Mara, the 11 townspeople arranged around the walls, at Evie, standing with her shotgun in the corner. Her expression was steady. 1 day, she agreed. No one slept. Or rather, everyone slept a little, and it felt like nothing. Nate sat on the front porch with his rifle and listened to the desert breathe and thought with a clarity that surprised him about how much he wanted to get through this. Not in an abstract sense. Specifically, he wanted to get through this morning and make it to the next one, and the one after that, and build something here that deserved to be built. The thought arrived with Mara's face attached to it, and he didn't push either away. Around 4 in the morning, she came out and sat beside him on the steps, not speaking. Just present her shoulder close to his, the blanket around her shoulders. When this is over, she said after a long time, yes. I'd like to go back to the ranch. She said it carefully, like something she was trying the weight of. For a while, if that's all right. It's your home, he said, for as long as you want it to be. She turned to look at him. In the pre-dawn dark, her face was hard to read, but he could see the shape of what was in it. It might be more than a while, she said. He held her gaze. That's all right, too. She looked away, back out at the dark road, but she didn't move away. Dawn came, gray and cold mist rising from the ground, the mountains visible in outline against a lightning sky. The birds started up small, tentative sounds, as though even they were uncertain what the morning would bring. The sound of hoofbeats came from the west at 6:30. Many hoofbeats. Not the thunder of a charge, but the steady, deliberate percussion of a large group moving at pace, which was worse in its way. It spoke of confidence, of men who expected no resistance and weren't hurrying because they didn't need to. Nate rose from the porch steps. Around him, in doorways and at windows, the town of Mineral Creek arranged itself as they had planned. 11 people visible. More behind glass. Pearl came to stand at his left, Mara at his right. Behind them, Evie Webb had her shotgun trained at the second-floor window above the general store. Gideon Rook rode into Mineral Creek at the head of 18 men, and he looked exactly as he had the day Nate had sat across his desk, immaculate, composed, his silver-streaked hair swept back from his broad forehead, his pale eyes moving across the scene in front of him with the assessing calm of a man who has never seen a situation he couldn't control. He reined in the center of the road and looked at Nate. Mr. Calloway. Conversational. Almost warm. I was hoping we could settle this before it became any more complicated than it already is. Then you've ridden a long way for nothing. Rook looked past him at Mara. Something in his pale eyes shifted, not anger, but the particular cold attention of a man accounting for an inconvenient variable. My dear, he said, whatever he's told you, don't. Her voice cut across his with quiet, absolute finality. Don't speak to me as though we're acquainted. You don't know me. You tried to sell me. Rook absorbed this without visible reaction. He looked at Pearl. Miss Morgan, I was wondering when you'd show your hand. I've been showing it for 3 years, Pearl said. You just weren't paying close enough attention. Rook was quiet for a moment. He looked at the buildings, at the faces in the windows, the people in the doorways. His men sat their horses in a loose line behind him, and Nate watched them with his peripheral vision, watching for the one who would move first. You understand what you're doing. Rook addressed the town, not Nate, not Pearl, the people in the buildings, the witnesses. You're taking the word of a grieving widower and a woman who arrived here under suspicious circumstances against the word of a man who has been part of this community for 20 years. You're risking your livelihoods, your property, your safety on the strength of a telegraph message and some papers. A silence. My sister's name was Rose, Pearl said. She stepped forward from behind Nate and Mara, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. She was 23 years old. She answered one of your advertisements 3 years ago, and I have never heard from her since. I have your shipping manifest with her listed as dry goods. She held up the paper visible to everyone. Does anyone here want to tell me that's not enough reason to take this seriously? A man stepped out of the general store. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. My daughter, he said, 2 years ago. A woman from the church doorway. My niece. Another voice from further back in the crowd that had gathered. My wife. They came forward one by one, not many but enough. Enough to stand in the road between Rook's men in the building where Mara stood. Enough to constitute a fact. Something changed in Rook's face. Not breaking Nate didn't think Silas Voss Gideon Rook was a man who broke easily, but a recalculation. A realization that the arithmetic of the situation had changed while he wasn't looking. His hand moved toward his coat. Don't, Nate said. His rifle came up. Pearl's came up beside it. And from the second-floor window above the general store came a double click that was unmistakably Evie's shotgun. This is over, Rook. The evidence is already in Tucson. It went yesterday by courier. Whatever happens here this morning, it won't change what the federal court is going to find. Rook stared at him across the road. There were copies, he said. Pearl's been doing this for 3 years. Did you think she'd keep everything in one place? Something that might have been in another man. The first acknowledgement of defeat moved through Rook's pale eyes. He was still calculating. Nate could see it, still looking for the angle, the moves that changed the game. He hadn't found it. The riders behind him were shifting, not moving to draw, moving away from it. 2 men had their hands up, open and visible. A third had eased his horse backward. They were men who had been paid for their loyalty, and men paid for their loyalty had a way of counting very precisely what that payment was actually worth. Tell me something, Rook, Pearl said into the silence. Was it worth it, all of it? The money, the influence, the years of making sure every man in your pocket stayed bought. Was it worth what it cost the people you did it to? Rook looked at her. Everything has a price, he said. That's all I ever understood. Everything has a price, and someone is always willing to pay it. Then your time to pay is coming, Nate said. One way or another, this morning or in a federal courtroom, it's coming. The silence stretched. Then slowly Rook dropped his hand from his coat. He looked at Nate one more time, not with hatred, not with defeat, but with the look of a man filing something away for later consideration. We'll let the courts decide, he said. Yes, Nate said. We will. Rook turned his horse. His men followed. Not fleeing, there was no panic in it, but withdrawing, deliberate and controlled, the way Rook did everything. But they went. The road emptied. Mara exhaled a long, shaking breath she'd been holding for what felt like most of the morning. Nate lowered his rifle. Beside him, Pearl did the same. He's not done, Pearl said quietly. That wasn't surrender. I know, Nate said. He'll try something before the deputies arrive. I know that too. Then we watch through the night and we don't assume anything. Yes. Nate turned and found Mara's eyes on him, steady and clear. He said to her quietly, just for her, you all right? Yes, she said. And then with something in her voice that hadn't been there before, warmth or the beginning of it, arriving without announcement, yes, I am. They watched through the night in shifts. The clouds that had been building all day came through after midnight, dropping a soft rain that pattered on the roof of the boarding house and turned the road to mud and reduced visibility to almost nothing, which was both a comfort and a concern. Rook made his move at 3 in the morning. Not with riders on the road. With fire. The smell reached Nate before the light did smoke sharp and wrong at that hour, and he was out of bed and at the window before he was fully awake. The feed barn at the far end of the street was burning flames moving up the dry wood of its walls with the avid, indifferent hunger of fire that has found purchase. He could see figures retreating into the dark on the far side. 3 men, maybe 4. Within minutes, the whole town was awake. Someone had already organized a bucket line from the well, Evie from the general store directing the operation with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had drilled for exactly this contingency. Nate joined the line and worked beside the others for nearly 2 hours until the fire was out the barn, a ruin of char and steam, 2 of the townspeople's horses lost. No one was hurt. Whether that was luck or Rook's deliberate calculation damage without murder pressure, without the thing that made everything irreversible, Nate couldn't tell. When it was over, he stood in the road with mud on his boots and soot on his coat and looked at what was left. Pearl came to stand beside him. He's trying to make them afraid, trying to make the witnesses decide it's not worth it. Is it working? She looked down the road at the townspeople gathered around the remains of the barn. Some were frightened, yes. But the ones who had stepped forward yesterday morning are still standing together, still talking to each other with the body language of people who have decided something and are holding to it. Not yet, she said. Mara found him as the sky was beginning to lighten a thin gray smoke-smelling dawn. She had ash on her coat, and her hair had come loose from its arrangement, and she looked utterly exhausted and utterly determined. 2 more women came in during the night, she said, from Prescott. They'd been hiding at Pearl's boarding house, and when they heard what was happening, here they followed. She paused. They want to testify. Nate looked at her. It keeps growing, she said. That's what he doesn't understand. Every time he does something like this, she gestured at the ruined barn, he thinks he's reducing the problem, but he's making it bigger. Every person who sees what he's willing to do becomes another reason for someone else to stand up. He'll figure that out eventually. I hope it's too late by the time he does. She met his eyes. How much longer until the deputies? Pearl thinks today, maybe this afternoon. She nodded. Her jaw was set, her pale eyes steady. She had moved over the past days from the raw, survival mode watchfulness of the woman he'd found in the wagon to something more settled, not hard, not armored, but clear. Like water after sediment has finally had time to fall. Then we hold until this afternoon, she said. Rook came back at noon. He came alone. No riders, no men at his back. Just Gideon Rook on a gray horse riding into Mineral Creek from the west, at a walk dressed with his usual precision, his pale eyes taking in the ruined barn and the people gathered in the street without any readable expression. He stopped in the center of the road and looked at Nate. I'd like to speak with you, he said, alone. No, Mara said from Nate's left. Rook looked at her. Something moved through his expression, the reassessment of a man encountering an opponent he has consistently underestimated. She stays, Nate said. Rook looked at the sky at the ruins of the barn and the people arranged behind them. The deputies will be here in a few hours, he said. I know that. I'm not here to stop them. He looked at Nate directly. I'm here to ask what it would cost to limit the scope of what's about to happen. You want a deal? Pearl said, stepping forward. I want to understand my options. You have one option, Nate said. You turn over everything you have, every record, every associate, every name of every buyer, and you give it to the federal deputies when they arrive. That's the only conversation left to have. Rook looked at him for a long moment. Everything I've built, he said. Everything you built on other people's suffering. Yes. Another silence. A long one. And in it, something that might have been somewhere beneath the calculation and the cold intelligence, in the years of protected criminality, a recognition. Not remorse, but something. The acknowledgement of having reached the end of something. I'll need assurance, Rook said, that the information I provide is considered in sentencing. That's for the federal court to determine, Pearl said. Not us. Rook looked at the mountains to the east. All right, he said, quiet, final. Send for the deputies. When the federal deputies rode into Mineral Creek 3 hours later, 8 of them led by a deputy marshal named Cook, who had the weathered, seen-everything face of a man who had spent 3 decades in difficult places, they found Gideon Rook seated on the steps of the general store with his hands in his lap, waiting. He didn't resist. He didn't bargain beyond what had already been agreed. He gave them his records, his associates, the names of every buyer in his network, the locations of women currently in transit. He gave them all of it with the defeated thoroughness of a man who has decided that if the game is over, it is over completely. Cook took the records and looked at Nate over Rook's head. "You Calloway," he said. "Yes. Judge Morrison wants a full deposition. From you, from the woman, from Morgan." He looked around at the assembled townspeople, the ruined barn, the women who had arrived through the night. "Looks like you've been busy." "We were trying to stay alive," Nate said. Cook almost smiled. "That counts." The days that followed were not simple. Federal investigations are never simple, and the process of disentangling Rook's network, which stretched across 6 territories in 2 states, encompassing 38 documented victims and an unknown number of buyers, was the work of months, not weeks. Nate and Mara spent 10 days in Mineral Creek giving depositions, then 2 weeks in Tucson, where Judge Morrison presided over the preliminary proceedings with the careful, thorough attention of a man who understood that the record being created here would matter for a long time. Mara testified twice. She stood in the federal courtroom both times with her hands quiet in her lap and her voice level, and she said everything, all of it, clearly and without equivocation, and she did not look away from Rook when she said it. He sat at the defendant's table, and he watched her with his pale, still eyes, and he said nothing. His lawyers objected. He himself said nothing. It was as though he had made a decision somewhere in that final hour in Mineral Creek about what kind of end this was going to be. The trial concluded in November. Rook was convicted on 14 federal counts. His sentence was life imprisonment. Pearl was in the courtroom for the verdict. Nate sat beside her, and he watched her face when the judge read the sentence, and what he saw there was complicated relief and grief tangled together in a way that made complete sense to anyone who had spent 3 years fighting toward a moment and then had to stand inside it and discover that it didn't bring back what was lost. "Rose," she said quietly. "We'll keep looking," Mara said from Pearl's other side. She took the older woman's hand. "All the records he gave them there are names and locations. We'll keep looking until we find her." Pearl nodded. She didn't speak again for a while, but she held Mara's hand. They rode back to the ranch in early December, the two of them, through a country that had gone from the bronzed heat of late summer to the pale, clear cold of high desert winter. The mountains to the east held snow on their upper reaches, and the air smelled of juniper and the clean emptiness that comes with altitude and cold. They rode at an easy pace, neither of them in a hurry, both of them tired in the deep-down way that takes weeks to leave. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," Mara said when they crested the final ridge and could see the ranch below them, the house, the barn, the windmill turning slowly in the afternoon light. "What did you think it would feel like?" "Finished, maybe, like something completed." She looked at the landscape. "But it doesn't feel finished. It feels like the beginning of a longer thing." "That's what it is," Nate said. "Rook is convicted, but the networks he was part of didn't end with him. The women they never found won't stop being missing just because he's in a cell." He looked at her. "You know that?" "Yes," she looked down at the ranch. "And Pearl knows that, and the women who came to Mineral Creek." A pause. "I've been thinking about what to do with that." He waited. "The ranch is big enough," she said. "We have the space. And there will be women who need somewhere to come. Women who escape, women who are found, women who have nowhere to go while they figure out what comes next." She looked at him. "I want to make it into something. A place. Somewhere they can come and be safe and start over." He thought about the spare bedroom where she'd spent her first nights. The sewing room with its bolt on the inside of the door. About Ellie, who had kept that cabinet stocked out of the same methodical care she brought to everything. "All right," he said. "It'll be a lot of work. Yes. We'll need help. Pearl would come, and there will be others." He looked at her. "You built something back there, Mara, in Mineral Creek. People came toward it. That doesn't happen unless you're doing something right." She looked at him for a long moment, the wind moving through the loose strands of hair at her temples, the late afternoon light making everything the color of old gold. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." They rode down to the ranch together and put the horses up and went inside, and Nate built a fire in the kitchen stove while Mara moved through the rooms with the particular attention of someone relearning a space, touching things, looking out windows, deciding what it was. She found him in the kitchen. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. He waited. Before all of this, before the wagon, before Rook, before any of it, you said you'd been waiting for a chance to do something that mattered. And then I showed up and you decided I was it. She sat across the table from him. I want to know if you still feel that way, now that you've seen all of it, now that you know what it actually costs. He held her gaze steadily. Yes, even now, especially now. She was quiet for a moment, and then, I need to say something and I need you to let me say it without making it easier. All right. I was cargo. For weeks, I was an object being transported, and I had stopped believing that anything else was possible. And then you cut the rope off my wrists, and you gave me water, and you said my name like it mattered. Her voice was steady, clear of the voice of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is not afraid of it. I didn't trust you. I didn't trust anything. But you kept being the same consistent, quiet present until eventually trusting you was easier than not trusting you. She looked at him. That's not a small thing, Nate. That might be the most important thing anyone had ever done for me. You did the harder part, he said. Maybe we both did the hard parts. She reached across the table. Her hands settled over his, warm and deliberate. I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I'm choosing to be happy I am with you. He turned his hand over and held hers. I'm glad, he said. And then because it was true and because the moment was one of the rare ones where the true thing and the right thing were exactly the same. I love you, Mara. I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. It happened for me somewhere in those days in Mineral Creek, she said. When you stayed between me and those men, even though the numbers were terrible. A faint smile. I love you too, Nate Calloway. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the December light was turning the desert gold, and then copper, and then the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere in the house the wind found a loose board and spoke through it in a low, continuous note. They were married properly in the spring, not for legal protection this time, but because they wanted to be in the yard of the ranch in the morning light, with Pearl Morgan and Evie Webb and Clara from the telegraph office, and the first 4 women who had come to stay as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and uncomplicated, performed by a traveling judge who seemed genuinely glad to be officiating something that wasn't a lawsuit for once. Mara wore a blue dress the color of a clear winter sky. Nate wore his best coat. They said their words in the yard with the mountains visible in every direction. Pearl cried. Evie did not, but she came close. The sanctuaries, as they came to call it, grew slowly and then quickly the way things grow when the conditions are finally right. Pearl moved out from Prescott within the month, bringing her documentation and 4 years of contacts. She organized a system, discreet communication, safe routes, coordination with federal marshals through which women who had escaped Rook's fractured network could find their way to the ranch. Some stayed a week, some stayed a season. Some stayed longer and took jobs in Prescott or on the ranch and built lives that were genuinely their own. Rose Morgan was found in February in San Francisco working as a seamstress at a manufacturing concern that turned out to have been a loose front for another trafficking network with ties to Rook's operation. She was brought home to Pearl in the spring, thin and quiet, and damaged in ways that would take a long time to heal. But she was alive. She was found. Nate was the one who told Pearl, and he stood beside her while she wept, and he thought about Ellie, about the promise he'd made to himself in the dark hours after her death, about how the weight of keeping a promise was nothing compared to the weight of having kept it. By the summer, 7 women were living at the ranch in various stages of whatever it meant to start over, and the sewing room had been converted to a schoolroom where Mara taught reading and writing and arithmetic and basic bookkeeping to anyone who wanted to learn. Her students were women rebuilding something rather than children beginning it, and that was in some ways harder and in some ways better. They had their difficulties. Money was tight in the first year. There were women who came and couldn't stay, too frightened, too damaged, too determined to disappear entirely and be unreachable. There were cases that couldn't be solved, women who were never found, corners of Rook's network that had sealed themselves shut against investigation. There were nights when Mara lay awake and the weight of it pressed down on her with its full force, and Nate would reach for her hand in the darkness and hold it without speaking, which was usually exactly the right thing. And there were other nights, many of them, and more as the years passed, when the house was full of women learning to trust their own futures again, and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen in the mornings, and children ran through the yard in the afternoon light, and Mara stood at the window watching it all with her hands wrapped around her cup, and something in her expression that was simply uncomplicatedly at rest. Years later, when the ranch had expanded and the sanctuary had become something of a model for similar efforts in other territories, and Nate had gray at his temples and Mara's hair had gone the color of winter clouds, they walked out together on a morning in early autumn to the eastern fence line. The post where the wagon had stood was still there. They'd never taken it down. Mara stood beside it for a moment. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "How close it came to going the other way?" "Sometimes." He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Does it still hurt when you think about it?" She considered this with the honest attention she gave to everything. "It aches," she said. "Not in the same place as it used to, more like an old injury that you only notice in certain weather." She looked at the fence post, then at the ranch behind them, then at him. "But when I think about what came out of it, what we built, what we found, the ache seems like a fair price." He took her hand. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what it comes down to, isn't it? You saved me from what Rook was going to do. I saved you from spending the rest of your life alone on this ranch, grieving for something you couldn't change." She looked at him. "We're even." "We're more than even," he said. She smiled, the full, real smile that had arrived so cautiously in those first weeks, and then gradually stopped being cautious at all. The smile that was his favorite thing in a life that had, against all probability, and by the choosing of two wounded people who had decided to try, filled itself up with things worth having. They stood at the fence until the morning light was fully up and the desert was burning gold in every direction. Then they turned and walked back toward the house together, toward the sound of voices and the smell of coffee and the work that waited for them. Good work. Hard work, the kind that never quite finishes but never stops mattering either. The Arizona sky wheeled overhead, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful. They walked into it.